I interviewed a tremendous number of experts, and I reported on what they had to say. And what they had to say was, and so in some cases they didn't want to go on the record under their own names, but in many cases they did. And what they were ringing the alarm bells about is the fact that there is almost no medical oversight and tons of push from within the medical community to affirm young teenage girls whose problem actually probably isn't gender. Nonetheless, they are fast-tracked to hormones and surgeries, which can do irreversible harm.
And in that answer, you're revealing a deep compassion for girls and others who are struggling with this issue. What you're really saying is it's about misdiagnosis and
That's right.
a sort of extraordinary societal push to endorse something that actually isn't going to solve the problem because the problems are elsewhere.
Yes, that's right. In a sense, this book has nothing to do with transgender people. And I mean that as someone who cares a lot about, transgender people. I've met a lot of wonderful transgender people in the course of writing the book. But the book is really about a copycat phenomenon among teenage girls who are in very real pain, but have mislocated what the source of their pain is. So they don't have typical gender dysphoria, and for that reason are very unlikely to be helped by the transition. And we're already seeing very high rates of regret.
That's a really significant point. We'll certainly seek to come back to that and Kira Bell, the whole European, British experience and what have you. But there's another aspect of this that you've written that really almost chilled me, because you see it in so many areas now. And it's what might be loosely called activism. And you actually wrote, I think I'm quoting this accurately, we're certainly seeing in the United States a young generation of doctors and therapists who are activists first and doctors second. Their ideological commitments precede their professional investigation. And indeed, some 6 or 7 years ago, the authoritative classification in America of psychological disorders, the DSM-5, I think it's called, changed the term gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. Can you explain what that change meant, why it's so significant, and to what extent it was potentially driven by activism rather than sound thinking and sound medicine?
Sure. To be honest, I'm not sure that particular change was driven by activism. I happen to have interviewed in my book the man who chaired the committee to write the DSM-5 entry. And, and he was also on the committee for the DSM-4. And they had a really robust and open discussion among the experts on gender dysphoria as to why they might choose a less stigmatizing term. It's still, of course, in a diagnostic and statistical manual of, mental health disorders. That's the name of the compendium. But I'm not sure that particular change was activist driven. But what you're seeing now is far worse. You're seeing doctors, young doctors, who attack me, who attack anyone who points out that, hey, these seem to be really hasty transitions. Young women who can't get a tattoo are having their breasts removed in the United States without even a therapist's note. And that kind of, raising that point and asking why and whether this is a good idea is just not usually the things that doctors would attack you over. But unfortunately today, the young doctors are there is a group of young doctors, young scientists who are so woke and so ideologically bent on a conclusion they've begun with that they will not countenance any questioning of their protocols.
This is deeply concerning. Now, in Australia, we're like America, we're a federation. And in one of our states today, parents whose child came home and said, I think I'm trapped in the wrong body, would be genuinely and legitimately concerned that, in contrast to, say, the kid coming home and saying, I think I'd like a tattoo, you could say, look, we don't think that's a good idea. Why don't you wait? Wait for 6 months, wait for 12 months or whatever, and then we'll talk it over and we'll think it through. But if you were to say that to a child who said, I think I'm trapped in the wrong body, we want to wait, let's work this through, let's have a look at the numbers and do the research, you actually literally could find yourself before the law for not affirming them And the woke brigade, if I can put it that way, at the very least would be screaming at you that you're placing your child's life in danger. And you have, I think, a major problem with this so-called immediately affirm approach to gender dysphoria, as opposed to wait, see, let's talk this through, let's look at the numbers. The numbers are really interesting, and we'll come to those in a moment. Do you think there's a good reason to think that a teenager could be wrong about that self-identification of being in the wrong body on the numbers and on your research?
Well, of course, not only are they, likely to be wrong, or, in this, especially in this case where they're so under the influence of, their peers, but we know something about teenagers. We know they're much more likely to, look, adults make bad decisions too. Okay. But we tend to trust adults to make those bad decisions. We don't tend to trust teens because they tend to make bad decisions under the influence of peers, meaning their peer approval means so much to them in those ages. You can't really expect them in many cases to exercise good judgment. This is something that psychologists have been able to test and show about teenagers. They're much more likely to engage in reckless activity if their peers approve of it. So I think that is, why we haven't historically trusted them to make these irreversible, decisions. And, lo and behold, we're seeing already really high rates of regret. I mean, any week you go to visit YouTube, you see new detransitioners, young men and women, but especially women, coming out and saying, I never should have done this. Where were the safeguards? Where were the doctors looking out for me?
Yeah. Now, can you just tease out a little bit more what you learned about the psychological disincentives or distinctives, of teenage girls versus boys in this whole environment, how they think things through, their dependence on peer group. Indeed, I think you've mentioned a couple of times too that in these strange times when, funnily enough, the sexual revolution seems to have done a lot of damage to romance, that a lot of teenage girls are very close to their mums, which is terrific, but they're not engaging in sort of early romances in the way that people of my generation, I nearly said yours and mine, but you're much younger than me, we might have. So there's not only the psychological distinctiveness, I suppose you could say, factors, but also the social factors that are making it a very different world for teenage girls at the moment.
That's right. We know we're seeing the loneliest generation on record, as American psychologist Jean Twenge referred to this generation. They spend a lot less time with each other in person and a lot more time online. So they're not getting the in-person comforts. They're being tortured by the online images and falling under the influence of online influencers. And unfortunately, these very unhappy girls are being promised that if they just start a course of testosterone, all their troubles will go away.
And so part of what they're catching on through social media would be a reinforcement of being led down a path and having that constantly reinforced because of this problem of following your line of interest and the way that plays out now with social media. They're not getting the alternative view, so they're increasingly locked into a view, this is my problem, and here's the answer. And that's affirmed all the way.
That's right. I spoke to a young woman, Benju, who talked about at 13 going online and experimenting by identifying as trans online. And she was showered with affection and congratulation from adults. And it made her feel amazing. She was 13 years old. She had trouble socially. She had a difficult, family life. And she was being showered with congratulations by adults who told her she was so brave and they were so proud of her. And eventually, of course, many of these adults reached out and asked for, pictures and things like that. They weren't actually so friendly. But the influences that are available to young people today and ready to encourage them down this road that are really legion.
And somehow or other, there's a status now associated with being a victim, being someone who's in need, who's been misunderstood, who's been pushed aside, and not reinforced. It's almost, a friend of mine put it as though the new victims are the new aristocrats. There seems to be, even amongst girls from middle-class backgrounds who really have been quite materially fortunate, but they're lonely and they feel victimized and isolated, and that victimhood thing emerges again.
That's right. At the very moment these young women are trying to individuate, they're being told that a lot of what they are is bad. They're being told that being white is unforgivable. They're born with the irredeemable sin of racism in America. We've largely bought into that, certainly at school. They're being told that being a woman means to be a victim. They certainly get that message through in a bad way. It means being abused. So they certainly get that message from online porn, which tends to be very, very violent. So these girls aren't spending that much time with each other in person. They have trouble making friends. So, the temptation to escape into this identity that's so valorized at school and with their therapists and with their teachers, it's very seductive.
Thank you for watching this episode. If you value vital conversations like this one, please like, share, subscribe, and join the conversation.